What's up, everybody? It's your favorite explanations, favorite nerd, and today we're going to be talking about the Decepticon Justice Division. So throughout the years, and since before I can remember, honestly, in regards to reviewing, since I've been reviewing this set for what feels like an eternity, but at least 5 years, I believe, whenever I would talk about the DJD, whether it was in a sit-down Saturday or looking at Mastermind Reformatted contributions or the Iron Factory offerings, whenever I would mention them, I would often hear in the comments, wish I knew who these characters were, they look cool, or why do you like them so much, I've never heard of them, etc., etc. So I figured we got a little bit of a lull in toys, why not take the opportunity and talk about these characters a bit. So it is commonly referred to as the DJD, the Decepticon Justice Division, and what I'm going to get into here will not be spoilery. I will have to watch some of the things that I say and talk about as a result. It's purely to explain who the characters are, what they're about, and why I dig them. So they were first seen in the IDW Comics More Than Meets the Eye series, written by James Roberts, illustrated by Alex Milne. Josh Burcham did the colors. I always bring him up because that palette is integral to what made that series stand out. It is, in my opinion, the best piece of Transformers fiction ever written. It explored all sorts of new ideas, concepts, world building, culture within the Transformers that had never been explored or had maybe been hinted about, and it extrapolated it to a point that made it fascinating. It rounded out characters, it created care on behalf of the fan base for characters that previously had not been cared for or about, i.e. Swerve, Whirl, etc., and added a ton of texture to the fabric of that universe. So the DJD popped up early on in More Than Meets the Eye, with Tarn gracing the cover with the big Decepticon face on it, and I remember seeing it for the first time, and I was like, wow, that's a different design for Soundwave. And basically, what they are a special forces operation. They're not your normal Decepticons. They don't join the regular infantry. They don't carry out the day-to-day routine tasks or military tasks of the Decepticon army. They're a special forces unit that has a very specific discipline, and their discipline is handed out to Decepticons, pretty much specifically. Now, of course, they wouldn't be above destroying an Autobot or laying an Autobot down, as it were, so to speak, but that's not their primary focus. They're not out there hunting Autobots. They're out there hunting Decepticons, and that's what makes them cool. So what they are basically a cult or a team of zealots, of fundamentalists, meaning they believe in the text above all else. They worship the text. Every word in the text is 100% believable and to be taken literally. And what text? Well, pretty much Megatron's texts. Things that Megatron has written in universe. So within the IDW universe, Megatron has basically published, for lack of a better term, a series of journals, which the DJD treat as if it were their Bible or a sacred religious text, to go so far as to memorize it and quote it as if they were quoting a passage from a Bible. And in their zealotry, they're pretty much given the task to hunt down unfortunate Decepticon names that have made it onto quote-unquote the list. Now, these guys are all traitors, transgressors, betrayers, deserters of the Decepticon army, cowards sometimes, in fact. People that have either detracted, like quit being a Decepticon, decided the war was not for them, or eddied out, as it were, or switched sides, went from Decepticon to Autobot because their state of mind had changed regarding the war, or could have just felt as though their numbers were outnumbered and overwhelmed and made a tactical decision to retreat. None of those things are really tolerated by the Decepticon point of view, and as a result, the DJD is formed to hunt down and dispatch these folks with swift justice. Their reputation precedes them, and in fact, many Decepticons, when they get wind that they're being hunted, will commit suicide just to avoid being a victim, and they travel along in their own ship known as the Peaceful Tyranny. Now, the group is comprised of 5 to 6 members, and I'll get into that a bit more in a moment, but it is widely believed that their names, Tarn, Kion, Voss, Helix, Saurus, etc., are not necessarily proper names, but more so the names of cities, the first cities that fell during the Decepticon Autobot War, and as a result, each member of the DJD was sort of graced with the title of one of those cities. So theoretically, they're what they call in the DC universe like legacy acts, meaning there may have been many Tarns, many Vosses, many Helixes over time, and we don't actually know what their real names are. We only know the title that they have taken up once they have entered the team. But for the sake of this conversation, we're just going to refer refer to them as the names that they're carrying during this moment in continuity. And we'll start with the leader himself, Tarn. And not only is he the leader, but he's also my personal favorite of the team. And the reason why I like him is because there's an element of elegance to him. And this is a fairly brutal team and a fairly brutal cast of characters, but he almost has like Hannibal Lecter vibes, where there's a sense of culture and a sense of education, and elegance is really like the way grace almost. He plays music, and the music in my head is like classical music. He quotes Towards Peace, the philosophical document that Megatron produced, and his claim to fame is that he has a way of talking and adjusting. I don't know if it's, I never quite understood if it's his literal vocal tones or kind of the things that he was saying, like unlocking Bucky Barnes in the, streetcar, 16, 38, snowy day or whatever. But it tends to make the spark of his victim self-destruct. He's super devoted to both the Decepticon cause and to Megatron, which is where the fusion cannon on his arm is definitely inspired by, and his faceplate that he wears is certainly a bit on the nose, both literally and metaphorically, as the face of the Decepticons. And he transforms into a tank, which is the one thing about this crew that doesn't quite seem in line to me, but it still works given his devotion and admiration of Megatron. Next, we'll go to Kion, who is one of my favorite characters in terms of design. And he's got kind of electricity kind of coursing around him. He's the communications guy for the team. He also maintains, updates, and keeps documentation of the quote-unquote list of all the Decepticons that are now on the literal hit list. He also has a connection to the Pet, which is another member of the team that we're not going to talk too much about in this video. But the Pet is definitely Kion's pet. For instance, on my shelf, I have Kion holding the leash. And he cares for the pet and loves the pet, like any respectable pet owner would. He transforms into a electric chair, which is just a sign of things to come in regard to a lot of their alt modes, that many of them turn into literal torture devices for the execution of members upon the list. Then there's Helix, the big blue fella. This dude got two big old arms and two little arms. He's like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito in twins, but wrapped up in one person. He's definitely one of the larger brawlers of the team, adds a lot of kind of firepower and muscle to their ranks. But kind of the most notable thing about him, aside from the four arms, is that he transforms into basically a cesspool. I think they call it a smelting pool, where he would grab the people on the list, put them inside of this smelting pool, and it heats up to a point that begins to melt the internal machinery of the robots, right? Of the victims that he puts into his cavity there, so to speak. So once again, another one that forms a torture device, and a pretty creative one as well. Next is Voss. This was the first member of the team that was released by MMC. He transforms into a sniper rifle, which I think is cool. It's kind of in the homage or in the spirit of Megatron, who they all worship as if he's a god or some sort of messiah. But he's also considered to be a scientist of sorts, and he only speaks in what they call primal vernacular, which is the old Cybertronian language. So in many ways, he's very devout, like a purist, very devout to the ancient ways, to what the Decepticons view as their kind of right and tradition. But even despite his alt mode and the fact that he doesn't speak the modern language, so you never really understand what he says, like even in the text bubbles and stuff, what he says tends to look like the writing in the Bay movies or whatever. Those two things are not the most notable things about him. The most notable thing about him is what MMC included in the accessory, which is that he can remove his face, and on the inside of his faceplate are like drills and screws and hooks and spikes and daggers and all of these implements, or maybe instruments of destruction, you might say, that he can put on his victim's face and sort of torture them to death. So that's really more so the most notable thing, that kind of memorable thing about him. Next is Saurus, the member that we just recently looked at. And once again, what I like about this character is that just because he's like the big brawling muscle doesn't mean that he's dumb. None of these characters are especially stupid, which is cool. But the kind of most notable thing about him is that he transforms into that death saw machine, where he grabs his victims with those claw hands and then lowers them slowly into it and just sort of treats them like a tree stump grinder and bashes them or cuts them into a billion pieces. That, and then that big red X on his face, which I'm not sure I understand understand why that's there. I'm sure it has some meaning, but it escapes me as to why, and I can't seem to find any quick links to it either, so we'll let that go. And then the very last member is Nickel. I'm not going to spend too much time on her. I'm not fond of the character. I don't think that she fits in quite well, but she is the medic of the team, but she's also kind of the leader in a way. She's like the old granny that like tells all of the young lads how to act, which kind of sounds cool on paper, and for me, it never really translated. It never really worked. I wouldn't have her if it wasn't a 2-pack where she came with the pet. The only reason why I got her is because of the pet. I'm not great. She just doesn't fit to me. Don't hate her, but it takes something that was like really dark, spooky, and scary and kind of turned it into a little bit of goofy. So I'm not crazy about it. But yeah, that's the team. That's kind of what they're about. They play a major role in the More Than Meets the Eyes series. If you're interested in reading that series, I highly recommend that you read it in the collected volumes from IDW under Phase 2, which collects both More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise and kind of lays them out chronologically and intercuts them as it makes sense timeline-wise. They play a major role in it, and without spoilers, it eventually comes down to a one-on-one drop-down fight. Is it drop down, drag out fight? I think that's what it is. Between Megatron and Tarn, where the famous line that I often quote in videos, "Two fusion cannons, look at yourself," comes from. A great era in Transformer comics, and my favorite Transformer fiction ever read, and some of my favorite characters in Transformers. And I also feel like they're cut of the same cloth of G1. They feel like they're in the spirit, which is why I did that video, Retro G1, where we take stuff that kind of is of today and apply it to G1. It's in the right spirit. And you can easily recognize when something is in the right spirit. So I hope that helped. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Take care.